Welcome to the Bean Pod, a podcast about decentralized finance and the Beanstalk protocol. I'm your host, Rex. Before we get started, we always want to remind everyone that on this podcast, we are very optimistic about decentralized finance in general and Beanstalk in particular. With that being said, 3 things. First, always do your own research before you invest in anything, especially what we talk about here on the show. Second, while you're doing that research, try to find as many well-developed, opposing viewpoints as possible to get the best overall picture. And third, never ever invest money that you can't afford to lose or at least be without for a while. And with that, on with the show. Beanstalk, like so many other Web3 projects and protocols, is, at its core, a technical creation. Economics plus computer science, with some front-end design for good measure, equals the farm and all the functions that go along with it. At least, that's how it might seem from a distance. However, when one takes a closer look, they'll see that, like so many other Web3 projects and protocols, Beanstalk is a creation driven by people. People interact with the protocol. People vote on how to change functionality or allocate budget resources, and people contribute their time and talent to make the project more successful. So, how does Beanstalk navigate all of these people situations? Before the exploit earlier this year, major governance functions were all on-chain. Educational and other information was produced by a number of departments like community, marketing, and design. Budgeting and contributor management duties were handled at the department level, with the heads of those departments completely independent of one another, for better and at times for worse. The post-exploit Beanstalk is radically different. Governance is temporarily off-chain, and the staff is significantly slimmer and more concentrated. A handful of incredibly talented folks are pouring themselves into the project to ensure its success, and we're lucky enough to be talking with one of them today. Austin, a longtime farmer, stepped into a contributor role during the post-exploit rebuild and now helps to oversee operations, governance, and budgeting processes. He's joining us on this episode to talk about things like DAO voting, the Farmer's Almanac, and Beanstalk's new approach to hiring and managing contributors. So Austin, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rex.
Great to have you. So how about you start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to Beanstalk?
Sure thing. Yeah, so I go by Austin in Beanstalk land. Perhaps unsurprisingly, that is also my name. And I have a background in computer science, had worked as a software engineer at a couple different non-crypto companies prior to Beanstalk, and had been casually interested and invested in crypto for a couple years, but hadn't really considered dedicating more of my career to it until last fall. An OG bean farmer introduced me to Beanstalk, and I immediately thought it was pretty interesting. And the more I tried to poke at it, the fewer ways I saw it breaking. So I ended up, leaving my last job earlier this year. Interestingly, I was actually taking some time off and not really working as part of the core team on Beanstalk. But then once the hack happened, there was just, I think Beanstalk needed some help, and I had some time, so I kind of dove in, and here we are now, where I basically spend all my time, energy, and brain power thinking about, how to improve Beanstalk.
Excellent. So when I think of what you do around the farm, there are the things that come to mind for me are things like governance and documentation. Is that a pretty good description? Is there more? Talk us through what your role looks like with Beanstalk.
Yeah, you bet. So I think my original hiring proposals, I think I made up some title like governance operations, which I think in my job I end up naming a lot of things, and I think we can write that one off as a big miss. But yeah, I sort of think about my role generally as taking care of everything that needs to get done outside of an engineering or marketing capacity. So, sometimes that involves, doing budget planning and drafting, the quarterly budget BIPs for Beanstalk Farms. Other times that's thinking about, off-chain security stuff that we can do to improve, the security of Beanstalk with regard to bug bounty programs, which we launched one this last week. All the way to writing documentation, which I spent a lot of time on pre-unpause when we didn't have a Git book of any sort. So yeah, it ends up spanning several different areas, and yeah, I just sort of see my role as making sure those things happen, basically. And of course, when I say me, it's me and our small but mighty operations team. It takes a village.
Yeah, indeed. So I think what we'll do is we'll kind of take all those pieces and start to kind of break them into smaller parts and maybe talk through them, because there's a lot of really interesting things that have happened really in each of those areas, from governance to documentation to, like, let's say, like, you know budgeting and like administrative components. So to look at governance, Beanstalk's had a lot of discussion about governance, especially, yeah, immediately before unpause, and actually even before, like right as the governance attack was happening. There was a lot of discussion about how governance in general should work, on chain versus off chain governance. And then as the replants occurred and we've started to get back to whatever the new normal is for Beanstalk, again, a lot of discussion about how decisions should be made. What's been your impression? What are the thoughts that have gone through your mind as these discussions have happened?
Yeah, all good questions. So, I think it was very wise on, the DAO's part after the governance exploit to not move too quickly. I think there's not that many examples out there in DeFi of very successful on-chain governance implementations. And, I think like many upgrades to Beanstalk, I think it's going to be a multi-step process of research and development. So obviously over the summer, the DAO, elected to uh, go with a somewhat permissioned, multi-sig form of governance in the meantime, with the intention of eventually implementing a more permissionless version in the future. And obviously that's really important because if Beanstalk's goal is to be, the most permissionless decentralized money on Ethereum, uh, there's really no getting around the fact of having to implement a permissionless version of governance. And you know, while you could certainly just slap back on the governance mechanism pre-exploit and say, all right, now when you obtain stock, you don't get voting power until the following block, which would improve flash loan resistance. There's certainly a lot more research to be done, in terms of making it secure and having it formally audited and such. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but just to answer generally as far as like why governance is important. It's Beanstalk is an upgradable smart contract, and it's not done, and so upgrades to that contract also need to be facilitated in the most decentralized, permissionless way possible. Um, and even the current setup of the multisig, leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah. So, what do you see as the process of moving from, so as you mentioned, after the exploit, we went to off-chain governance. What do you see as the process to moving back to something, like you said, something that's a little bit more on-chain, something that is more permissionless, and what that end goal might be?
Sure. Yeah. And there's a lot more research to be done here, but I'll sort of think out loud a bit about some of the current thinking processes. But I think we've talked a little bit about in the last couple DAO meetings this product offered by Halborn called Seraph, which is a blockchain notary solution that essentially allows a blockchain security expert on their team to uh, sort of audit these off-chain processes and on-chain processes that are happening. You know, in one of the BFPs that formed the multi-sig, there's in gory detail, documented all of the verification processes that the Beanstalk community multi-sig signers are supposed to follow and such. And even then, that from the on-chain perspective, that the call data for a submission to the BCM does what it claims to. And so, in terms of maybe some first steps, I think that's a pretty interesting thing to explore with Halborn in terms of just having an extra layer of security. And then you can think about all sorts of ways in which that could be censored. Maybe the government compels Halborn to block transactions, so you would want some sort of other community multisig that can remove Seraph. And so there's a lot of new stuff we're doing here with regard to governance structure and Beanstalk. And there are some precedents you can look at the various branches of the US government and how they govern each other. But so I mean, I've been talking for a couple minutes already, and that's like step one of probably many. And so you can imagine in the future, right now Snapshot is pretty limited, and voting isn't on chain. You could imagine a future step where voting is on chain, once again, and anyone can verify the results of a vote, which is a little bit tougher on Snapshot. And probably for a while, it probably makes sense to have the BCM still in place, even with the transition back to on-chain governance, similar to how Publius custodied ownership of the Beanstalk contract prior to the exploit, even though we did have fully permissionless governance, such that when security vulnerabilities are found, bug reports on Immunify are reported. There is some sort of way to implement security changes quickly, but of course, the eventual goal is the somewhat ossification of Beanstalk, and you can imagine some final step in the future. Who knows whether it's 1 year, 2 years from then, would be removing that Seraph implementation, removing ownership or transferring ownership of Beanstalk from the BCM to perhaps the null address, in which state you can sort of start to see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of, Beanstalk governance rather being as, decentralized as possible.
Excellent. And so I'm glad you mentioned Halborn and Seraph. So for those of you listening, we actually have a great episode where we interview folks from Halborn and talk about the Seraph system. It's episode 16 of the podcast. So glad you looped back to that, or glad you mentioned that, Austin. So you mentioned voting and how we're using Snapshot right now. There's been a lot of talk within the community about reaching quorum and what should be considered the approval of a particular measure, something like a budget versus a smaller, less influential item. Lot of discussion about things like let's call it voter turnout and maybe voter fatigue. What have been your impressions about how the DAO has made its way in terms of voting on different measures, and whether or not there is fatigue showing, and what could possibly be done to help improve interaction?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's tough because it's some of both. Like in some ways, it's probably maybe it's somewhat of a problem. In other ways, you know, something to just consider when thinking about future upgrades. I think you know. So Publius mentioned yesterday. This is for anyone listening. This is October 13th, the DAO meeting, and something that they've been spending time on is, or maybe just to zoom out a little bit, there's this one component of Beanstalk called the depot, which allows any protocol to come to Beanstalk and create what's known as a pipeline, which allows assets within Beanstalk to be used in those protocols. So just to give a quick example, you could imagine maybe I have some Ether or something like that in my farm balance, i.e. within the Beanstalk contract, and I want to use that Ethereum to open a liquidity trove. That would require someone to write code specific to liquidity to integrate with Beanstalk's internal farm balances. And the reason I mentioned that example is you know, we're sort of switching gears to a more generalized setup such that less code needs to be written for each of these integrations, and it can sort of be written once and last forever. And so when it comes to governance, I think from an engineering perspective, like upgrades like that are really important, such that every time in this future state where Uniswap comes to Beanstalk and wants to integrate with farm balances, or Liquidity comes to Beanstalk and wants to do so, that it doesn't require a whole BIP. So I think that kind of addresses some of the concern in terms of, I suppose, voter fatigue, in terms of how often BIPs are being proposed and such. But of course, once we get back to permissionless governance, there's no reason someone couldn't be proposing a BIP every day. It just so happens that at the moment, many BIPs are proposed by the couple of decentralized organizations formed by the DAO, in Beanstalk Farms and Beansprout. So that's kind of like, I guess, one comment I have to make on the voter fatigue front. But I guess another thing I'd want to add is, thinking philosophically about what is required for Quorum to upgrade Beanstalk and make changes. From my perspective, it's pretty hard to imagine Quorum for BIPs being anything less than majority. But there are a couple of things that can help out with that. One is that sort of more generalized architecture upgrades that I mentioned just a second ago, and the other is there are certain classes of changes that require whole BIPs right now that maybe shouldn't in the future. So one topic of discussion that's been taking place in the community over the last couple of weeks is the work required to simply update the seeds per the seeds per BDV for a given asset that's whitelisted in the silo. So there's various assets whitelisted in the silo, and for depositing different ones, you may receive different numbers of seeds. And that's the sort of upgrade that maybe it shouldn't require 50%. Maybe the DAO should just vote on some ideal ratio of how many seeds all of those various assets have, and then have Beanstalk target that, for example. So those are a couple thoughts I have, but we could probably, there's probably a bit more to dig into in terms of, what voting looks like, maybe potential like delegation solutions, things like that. But those are just a couple initial thoughts I have.
Do you have any particular opinion or view? It seems like that's become, a popular topic, where if I was not planning to be especially active in the DAO, I could delegate the votes come along with my stock to someone else and essentially give them increased voting power to try to meet quorum. I mean, is that something that could potentially happen?
That's a great question. I mean, that's the sort of thing that, we as a community, et cetera, need to do some more thinking and research on. Just, you know, spitballing a little bit, you can imagine how if you could delegate voting power of your stock, that could, you know, centralize somewhat quickly. I don't know if, I don't know if you guys went through like sort of the airdrop interface for whether it was like ENS or Optimism, et cetera. Like at the time you claim your airdrop, it asks you if you want to select particular delegates to delegate your voting power to, but not your tokens. And with those sorts of systems, it's not like I really know much about optimism governance in particular. I'm kind of more inclined to just, pick someone that the first one that's suggested to me or where a lot of other people are delegating to. And, one of the really elegant things about the stock system is that, um, I mean, not just the distribution of bean mints decentralizes over time, but also voting power. So that would mitigate that a little bit. And so you can sort of think about like, well, how can you mitigate that part of it? It's like maybe you can have some sort of limit of, voting power ownership on a given address. But of course, Ethereum addresses aren't Sybil resistant, but you can, maybe people are delegating stock to people based on reputation, so it'd be hard to, attract delegate votes to multiple addresses if you're a single person or entity. So those are just a few thoughts. I don't think anyone has the perfect answers at the moment, but certainly something to think about.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of good, healthy discussion happening inside of the DAO. And admittedly, one of the things that I appreciate is that the community has produced a lot of individuals that have a desire to really find the right answer as opposed to the quick answer.
Yeah, and I would just add another thing that I think it's quite amazing that like, at what is it, maybe 60 million stock supply, a year and a couple months after initial deployment, and for things that are, you know, I mean, even like BIP 24 is like an architectural upgrade, and I don't think it was super controversial. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about the budget BIPs, and I think it's kind of amazing that, you know, I think as important as it is to have all this discussion about potential solutions, I think, in my opinion, I think there hasn't been a high quality BIP that, has failed to reach quorum. So,
Yep, I agree.
but we'll see what happens in the future. No telling what happens.
So I want to shift gears just a little bit. So you mentioned earlier the Farmer's Almanac. Would you take a minute to kind of walk us through what that is, what's included in it, what benefit it offers folks that are, either maybe new to the protocol or refamiliarizing themselves with it after replant? Yeah, just talk us through the document a bit.
Yeah. Well, to set the scene a little bit, I think when Publius deployed Beanstalk, the only form of documentation was the white paper, which is probably one of the most, well, probably the most thorough document about Beanstalk in existence, albeit pretty complex and technical, as I'm sure we've all experienced. And I think over the 6, 7, 8 months that Beanstalk was on, after that, it sort of like emerged that the most widely circulated information about Beanstalk or teaching people about Beanstalk was uh, various articles written by community members. And so I think that was sort of an indication that there was a strong desire for, um, some documentation that, could be thorough, but perhaps a little bit more more accessible. So that was something that, Beanstalk Farms had spearheaded over the summer, a little bit before the unpause. And yeah, that came in the form of the Farmer's Almanac, which no new crazy ideas. A lot of other DeFi protocols have Git books associated with their white papers, but in Beanstalk's case, the Farmer's Almanac is a more accessible version of documentation explaining Beanstalk. But the goal is to still be, as thorough as possible and not shy away from complexity too much.
Yeah, when I think of the Farmer's Almanac, I think of how to use Beanstalk. And to your point, the white paper is incredibly thorough, also incredibly technical. For me, the Farmer's Almanac is something that I can turn to and be like, well, okay, so this after unpause, after replant, this function has been added, or this new type of asset has been added. What is that thing? How do I use it? Is there anything I should be worried about? And it's really a very practical resource for folks that are participating in the protocol.
Yeah, and you make a good point, which is there's also various how-to guides on, simply using the Beanstalk interface. So that's another component of it. And then of course, it's also nice to be able to, send folks links to specific sections. Like, someone's asking about unripe assets in Discord, you can send them a link to the Farmer's Almanac, whereas it's a little bit more difficult with the white paper in its PDF format.
Yeah, I completely agreed. And as I think about what will be core documentation or core resources as Beanstalk continues to grow, it seems like as the protocol develops, there's still just a lot of complexity. And so documents like the Farmer's Almanac are really going to continue to be key as we bring new participants in and as the protocol itself develops, just to make sure that people are on the same page and that they can get their questions answered, at least from a starting point. A lot of folks get involved with the protocol and they have a lot of really basic questions about what a particular asset is, how it works, what it does, what they can do with it. And, even if before long their questions are a lot more complex, at least they can get through those first initial discussions in a way that they can do on their own at their own pace. And then as more complex questions form, they can ask those to members of the community or at university classes, and be ready for a little bit more in-depth discussion.
Totally. And another thing I didn't mention is, in the Farmer's Almanac, there's a lot of things that warrant documentation that are outside of the scope of the white paper. So things like, how to get started contributing, for example. And there's probably a couple others that I'm not quite thinking of at the moment.
Yeah, so I would direct any listeners to that Farmer's Almanac. It's such a good resource, great starting point. So to shift gears one more time, I want to talk about the Beanstalk Farms Committee and what the BFC does, what their role is, how they represent the DAO, what decisions they make, and how they keep the protocol growing and progressing.
Sure. So I think it might be interesting and or helpful to talk about, the state of Beanstalk Farms pre-exploit, which was a pretty interesting experiment in decentralized development, which was, after I think the first ever Beanstalk Farms budget in Q4 of last year, there was this proposal structure set up such that anyone with, I think it might have been like a couple thousand stock, could propose to use the Beanstalk Farms budget in some way, whether it's be hired on a recurring basis to work on particular things, or for one-off budget uses. And all of those proposals were optimistically approved. And if just thinking about it, that's a pretty interesting structure, given how, when you look at a lot of other DeFi protocols in terms of use of their, treasuries and grant programs, things like that. um, it's a lot more formal. But I think, in the state that Beanstalk was in, where, Publius was totally anonymous and, couldn't tap anyone in their network to come work on Beanstalk, it was really, just this really organic group of people from the internet that became bean farmers and decided to start working on Beanstalk. So I think at the time, that structure for Beanstalk Farms made a lot of sense. And it was pretty cool in many ways to see, the team grow in so many different departments, both in breadth and magnitude. And, after the exploit, of course, there are a lot of folks that uh, decided they, weren't able to continue working on Beanstalk or something else. And as Unpause approached, something that a few of us were thinking about was, how can we figure out some sort of structure that's, as decentralized as possible, but can still facilitate the, you know, uh, how should I put it? Good uses of the Beanstalk Farms budget. And so that was sort of where what we call the Beanstalk Farms Committee was formed. And this was, formed by the DAO perhaps in July or so, and then myself and a few other people proposed to the DAO to be added to that committee. And so, as far as to answer the question of like what the Beanstalk Farms Committee is, in essence, it's a group of contributors voted on by the DAO that have discretion over the Beanstalk Farms budget. And that budget, of course, still has to be, the current structure is that we propose to the DAO quarterly to mint new beans. So that's a little bit about what it is. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about, in particular, from a personnel perspective, different things that we want to allocate resources to. And so I think this was pretty transparent in the most recent budget bit, but a lot of the funds are going towards hiring engineers, perhaps for obvious reasons. There's sort of an unlimited amount of work to do on that front across the stack, whether it's front end, subgraph and bots work, all the way to the contracts level. So that's in one particular place that a lot of budget funds end up getting allocated towards. And yeah, I think it's sort of interesting. Maybe just like a quick aside. I'm not sure if you guys have saw the sushi head chef sort of like election process, but I think that this sort of committee based organization, if you will, is a little bit more of a decentralized and elegant implementation of that structure.
Yeah, it seems like there is such a tension between, and you hit it when you talked about the pre-exploit Beanstalk organization, where it was so organic, and I would say at times to a fault, and could be difficult to both, let's say, locate and secure quality talent that was well informed about how DAOs and Web3 organizations work, and in the right place to contribute the right things, but at the same time brought a lot of outside knowledge, a lot of atypical viewpoints, a lot of really good, unusual like contribution and energy to the protocol, to the project. And then that real formalized, what we probably consider a Web 2 or corporate America structure that can at times be, bogged down and rigid. And the advantages and disadvantages to everything across that spectrum. And it's been interesting to watch Beanstalk wrestle with that and how the committee has developed from those questions and the desire to kind of hit the sweet spot in between the two.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned something about how pre-exploit it was very, very organic. I would almost go as far as say that right now, perhaps it's too inorganic. Something that we've been thinking a lot about recently is how can someone in the community contribute to Beanstalk without ever having to talk to anyone or send a Discord message, like across the stack, whether that's contributing to the Git book or the white paper, or making open source contributions to the front end or the contracts. For example, when someone wants to permissionlessly propose a BIP, is the expectation that they also implement the feature in the UI, or account for that change in the white paper. These sorts of things, or these sorts of processes aren't super well documented right now, and that's a problem. So that's something that I'm going to be spending more time working on and thinking about over the next month or two.
So is there a path that, and admittedly, I'm not an engineer, not a technical resource, so I have to navigate these things as best as I can. But like, is there a path where at some point someone that has particular experience with smart contracts can look at our open source code and say, okay, I see an opportunity for either an improvement or an additional feature, and be able to move through that process, like you said, without necessarily, even sending a Discord message?
Well, if you think about how the exploiter did it, they certainly did it without
That's
sending a
very fair.
Discord
Very
message.
fair. Yeah.
So when it comes to upgrading the contracts, and your specific example, that requires a BIP. So certainly the eventual goal, again, once in this like sort of multi-stage transition process back to on-chain governance that I mentioned earlier, the end state of that certainly would be exactly that, where you can simply propose the change to the DAO, and the DAO has discretion about whether to implement it or not.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I mean, what goes through my mind is, as you mentioned, that is both edges of that sword. Having the potential for somebody that's got experience and knowledge to look at a particular problem or opportunity and be like, yeah, I can solve that, and make that process as frictionless as possible is really exciting. But to your point, knowing that, essentially the exploiter did just that, saw an opportunity, and in what we would probably consider, a method that we wish had more friction in it, if for no other reason than to be able to raise the alarm better, made that change. It's both really exciting and a little bit worrisome. And so, kind of your point about this idea of utilizing the BIP process, that seems like a good safeguard, but really some really interesting opportunities out there.
Yeah, I mean, what I would add on that front is, being able to propose a change to the DAO without ever talking to anyone or sending a message. Having that be possible is different from that being the default desirable state, in my opinion. So, like, I think from a process perspective, I think that's the goal from like a technical perspective, allowing someone to permissionlessly propose BIPs. But, and I'm just, speaking, in my own opinion here, I think that's separate from sort of the social norms that the DAO adopts around, perhaps, BIP, drafts or write-ups of the BIP should be shared X days in advance of proposal, such that it can, discussion can be facilitated within the community. Yeah, when I give the example of permissionless proposing BIPs, I don't mean to say anything about how discussion is not important or something like that. It's very important. All that stuff is critical to the success of Beanstalk, but just from a technical perspective, that is the desirable state in my
Well,
view.
and it draws a really good distinction. And I think about the fantastic conversation that's happened within the community about quite a variety of different BIPs and other changes. That I don't even know if it's at this point if it's even really possible for someone to try to implement a change without that discussion happening, if for no other reason the community has seemed to demand it. I mean, there's a lot of folks that are talking and picking apart recommendations or proposals for improvement and looking at those opportunities from a lot of different angles and driving really good discussion. And yeah, I think you just hit it, and even as we talk about it, and I follow your example of of being able to propose something. The social norm aspect, like you said, doesn't really allow that. But from a technical perspective, if someone can navigate that side of the process easily, it should naturally facilitate unique solutions from folks that might not have the same access to core contributors or to Publius or whoever, but still have great things to offer. It gives that opportunity for those things to happen. While, like you said, from a social norm standpoint, the discussion is inevitable. The community demands it.
Exactly. And I would just also add that, even in the earlier days of Beanstalk, where coincidentally Publius may have implemented, the code for a handful of BIPs, there were multiple ideas that probably would have never existed if it weren't for the community. Um, I think convert is one of those. I don't quite remember who had originally brought it up, but I think that's a great example of a very high leverage change that was sourced from the community. And um, I don't know offhand, but I'm pretty certain that there's definitely at least several others, and that share that situation.
That's a great example, and yeah, man, it's tempting to give credit to Syncubate. My knee jerk reaction is think that he brought it up. There's a chance that he might not have brought it up, but just drove a lot of the discussion. I mean, when I think back to those times, there were a lot of folks that were offering really interesting ideas and contributions. Another one is we just put out the episode about the pod marketplace. There were a lot of really great examples of folks coming up with really unique ideas and implementing those, and again, to use that term organic, doing it in as organic a fashion as possible, within that pre-exploit team and situation.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, maybe just to put a pin on that topic, I think, and again, this is just how I sort of think about it, but I think perhaps a desirable end state of Beanstalk Farms is one where in many ways the contracts, the UI, the subgraph are essentially close to their final state, and we just have Beanstalk Farms pays a lightweight set of maintainers, of which there will certainly be processes for. So for example, someone would need discretion over what changes to the Git book should be made, for example, which is like an off-chain process that someone would need to manage. But um, yeah, it's really interesting to think about. Uh, the way the DAO has chosen to develop Beanstalk is in this super decentralized fashion, and it'll be really interesting to see what the structure of those various organizations look like a couple years from now.
Completely agreed. So, what are the different ways that folks can get involved with Beanstalk now? From a desire to be a core contributor, doing things like engineering work, all the way to making infographics and doing small marketing tasks or social media tasks. What are the different ways that folks can get involved with Beanstalk?
Yeah, so we recently added a contributing page to the documentation, which gives sort of like a lightweight process for this. But in essence, it's sort of from the perspective of working on Beanstalk via Beanstalk Farms. It's sort of reaching out to the BFC member in question based on your skill set. So when it comes to engineering, Silo Chad is currently the best person to reach out to. When you mention social media or content creation, Mod on Discord is probably the best person to reach out to. Um, and if something else, feel free to shoot me a message on Discord. And similar to what I was saying earlier, it's sort of not the most frictionless process at the moment. So something that we're thinking about a lot, certainly. Because for example, again, like once the UI is open source, you shouldn't necessarily need to hop on a call with someone, and should just be able to open a PR and describe the changes. So that's sort of how we're thinking about things, from a directionally making contributions more permissionless. But those are the folks in general that you can reach out to at the moment.
And I guess what I'd like to tack onto that is, it sounds like there are opportunities kind of at all different levels of time availability, technical direction, skill set. It's not necessarily a situation where, like, if you want to contribute in a technical fashion, you need to necessarily be ready to dedicate 60 hours a week to being a full-time dev. It seems like we've got, everything from opportunities that probably do look very much like that, all the way out to like the new bug bounty program that, is much more like self-driven, and, for folks that have a desire to look through the code and white hats that can find opportunities to improve. And then on the, the non-technical side, similar situation. If you want to, contribute to marketing efforts, for example, you don't necessarily need to go to Mod and say, hey, do you need somebody that can put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week? You can find opportunities through things like grant programs to contribute from the marketing end or the social media end. And there's opportunities for anyone that wants to be involved and that can show that they've got that valuable skill set.
Totally. I think a great example is the community member who started a discussion around the Sunrise incentivization mechanism and just started working on it. And I think that's that's really fantastic energy that we want to sort of foster as best we can.
Completely agreed. Well, Austin, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rex.
You can find Austin on the Beanstalk Discord. The Bean Pod is a production of Beanstalk Farms, a decentralized autonomous organization. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Medium, Discord, and our home on the web at bean.money. You can also find me on Twitter at RexTheBean. And as a final reminder, this podcast is not financial advice. Thanks again for listening.